Well, people seem to either love or hate these tier lists, but they generate a lot of discussion that I like to see, so we're going to keep it going. This time with a focus on mid-range and I guess tempo decks are kind of the two here. So we talked about aggro the last time. I wanted to lump tempo in there just because I think they play pretty similar. There's almost an argument to make as something strictly mid-range versus tempo. Sometimes your terms get a little bit muddled, but they're similar within Hearthstone. And the same rules are going to apply to the previous aggro one. So if you were to play this deck from this class for the whole season, this tier list should tell you about where I think you would end up. So let's get started with what is generally a pretty good class, but I'm going Warlock, so nothing in the triple F tier again. But mid-range Warlock, you really don't see it, and there's a number of reasons why. The main one being that the class cards don't really help. Anything that tries to be kind of in that mid-range level as far as mana cost goes, it just doesn't work with that style. So you've got things like Void Terror, Doomguard, Bane of Doom, some awkward cards for their downsides. Boy, I can't even remember the name of like the taunt that destroys your own mana crystal. Was it Void Lord or something? Pit Terror, Pit Lord? That's right, Pit Lord, I think. That hurts yourself by 5, 4 mana, 5/6, hurt yourself by 5. Just very awkward cards, generally not good. Yeah, don't fit into any real deck, and where Warlock tends to shine is when you can use your hero power the best. So on the high end, right, with hand lock, you're just filling your hand with cards, getting the benefit of cheap cards. You've got tons of options, great stuff in the deck as a whole. And then with Zoo, you're flooding the board with minions. You start to get the mana to where you can draw more cards, flood it even further. You don't really lose momentum. But with mid-range, what they tend to shape up to be, in Hearthstone at least, is just playing minions on curves. You want like an Argent Squire on 1, a Knife Juggler maybe on 2, into a solid 3, 4, 5, that kind of thing. And usually you top out around 6 or 7 mana. Maybe you've got like one thing at the high end of that. But Warlock won't really be able to use its hero power in those times. You don't really need the card draw. And so that, coupled with these terrible cards, that's why you never really see it on ladder. Don't think it's a big surprise. I don't think I've even tried it as like an experimental thing because it just seems so bad, and I can't think of a way to even potentially make it work for some kind of like fun meme day. So that's why, yeah, got it on the bottom here. Then I'm going Priest. Now with Priest, I will say, I had a day somewhat recently where I tried a mid-range Priest, and it wasn't that bad. It's like D plus or something here in the tier list. Maybe it could scrap its way up to C. I think it would need a little more time and attention, a little more love, maybe a more refined list. But the idea with it was to include 2 Mind Blasts. Now, the reason being, Priest, again, much like Warlock, doesn't really have the class cards to support that mid-range style. There's not a lot in the early game to secure the board, right? You got Northshire Cleric, but then your best tool is like Shadow Word Pain on the following turn. Maybe you can use a Holy Smite or a Power Word Shield to kind of try to snowball the board. But generally speaking, you're leaning more towards neutral minions. And neutral minions are good. They actually fit into most mid-range lists, at least to some degree. But those 2 Mind Blasts were there to kind of make up for what's lacking. Neutral cards tend to fall just behind class cards. So if you don't have that big benefit with your class cards, if they don't really fit into the style, the archetype, you need something to help because it's not going to come from those neutral minions. So that's where the Mind Blast came in. It's a more aggressive list. I think it topped out with like Argent Commanders. Maybe there was a Reg in there or something like that. But yeah, it was enough where through kind of the mid game, you could use Yetis or Senjins, that kind of thing, to just chip away, get enough damage. You know, you've got Akanai Soul Priest, a decent 4-drop already, and then just a bunch of regular neutrals, your Azure Drakes, things like that. To yeah, hopefully secure the board. But I think, yeah, would need a little bit more time to ever get to that C tier. Wouldn't really recommend it. But there's maybe something there. Maybe a little something to experiment with going into the future. Here in the C, we've got Rogue and Warrior. So Rogue, I think it's got to be like a tempo Rogue. You can't really do a normal mid-range without trying to get that tempo. I think Rogue doesn't have a lot that helps out with that kind of style. Their removal, if it's not damage, their hard removal with like Assassinate is just awful. It doesn't really fit in control. It doesn't really fit in mid-range to kind of help you deal with those big threats. So you've got things like Eviscerate and Backstab. You can use your SIs. But it's all like these little bits of damage that really, yeah, force you towards more of a tempo style. You can use things like Perdition's Blade in this deck, though, which I really like. You kind of get that immediate damage on play. You get the Battlecry effect, which can be actually pretty good if you can combo it. And then your weapon will usually be used to remove other minions on the board. And you can kind of snowball something that's, yeah, pretty deadly. Top it out with like things like Assassin's Blade on the high end. There's some other 6s, you know, maybe it's an Argent Commander. Again, I think if you're kind of going to be more aggressive. But you should be able to get like a few turns out of an Assassin's Blade, do a decent amount of damage. So it's okay. This is the kind of deck I've played with before. Seems a little hit or miss based on the matchup. It just lacks a bit of oomph. You can just feel that it's not Rogue's best archetype. Feels a little bit weak, but if you're going to play tempo, or any sort of, you know, middle-of-the-road mid-range deck, it's got to be this kind of tempo version of Rogue. So it's okay. You might be able to get to Legend with it if you really put in the time, but I wouldn't expect to get very far with it. Then we got Warrior. Warrior, I've seen people play with the tempo style as well. I think you go for that more so than a mid-range thing. Now, Warrior just has some good cards, right? They got like Fiery War Axe, Cruel Taskmaster. Then I think this uses like Frothing Berserker and Korkron. So a few things in that realm. Maybe you throw in an Arcanite Reaper, a Greenskin, something like that. You're definitely utilizing your weapons. But it's kind of in a similar place to these other classes where the hero power, for one, does not help you generate tempo at all. You're not really going to be running it in combination with like a shield slam like you would with a control warrior, because it does. It just loses too much tempo, and then you don't have shield block, things like that. But as well, the cards that Warrior has to support this kind of tempo archetype, they're like half there, right? There's an idea. The few that I listed, they're actually quite good for it. They can help you execute a nice cheap bit of removal. You can use like Whirlwind in combination with it, or you can use that for the Enrage effects, you know, buff up a Frothing. There's a decent amount of stuff there. And then the option of that pirate package, like I said, if you're going with Greenskin or what is it? Dread Sail Corsair, right? The 4-mana 3/3 taunt. You can make them pretty cheap, get them out. There's an okay there, but you really do feel like the other half of the Warrior package is just kind of missing, right? It tends to be very good in control, that sort of style that's going to get you into the late game, generate a lot of value in the late game. Cards like Brawl aren't really going to be that useful for you, so yeah, I've seen people run it in Legend. I've played it before. It's okay. I think, again, you could probably get to Legend if you put in the time, but there's just better decks, and, well, especially if you're playing Warrior, there's better archetypes out there. Beyond that, I'm going Hunter and Mage. So this is where you start to get into what you actually see on ladder. Everything else is a bit experimental for fun. But I've actually seen like a decent amount of these decks that are left, these classes that are left. So, Hunter, mid-range Hunter, it's okay. It's a pretty balanced deck. It does good against Warrior and just sort of okay against everything else. Now, there's a few ways you can build it. I think generally you're going to go for the Beast package, where you've got things like River Croc into Animal Companion, into Houndmaster, or you're coining that Houndmaster onto your River Croc. Sometimes you're using Deadly Shots. I personally think it's very, very good to include them. Mostly for the Druid and Rogue matchups. It's a really good, efficient piece of removal on big targets. But some people just opt not to use them. There's also a lot of flexibility in your traps, right? Things like Freezing Trap are going to work better against Druid. Things like Explosive Trap are going to work better against Zoo. Some people even just go Snake Trap. Try to get some draw with Starving Buzzard. You get another target for Houndmaster. Usually you've got Kill Command, so it's another bit of Beast synergy there. A lot of flexibility in how you build it. But yeah, generally speaking, I think you're quite favored in the Warrior matchup, the Control Warrior matchup. Everything else is just, it's around that 50% mark, I find. There might be some stuff that falls a lot lower than that. But it's, yeah, just kind of okay across the board. It's another one of these decks I feel like it lacks a bit of oomph. Like, I just wish there was like one or two more cards that really worked in that archetype to make it a bit better. But it's okay. If you play it throughout the season, I'm confident you'll hit Legend at some point. You'll do okay in Legend. But I don't think you're taking it too far. And then there's Mage. Mage has both a sort of standard mid-range, like you'd expect, where you're just, you're dropping minions on curve 1 all the way up through 6, 7, 8. I think it usually tops out with like a reg. Or you can go the tempo style, which is going to be a little bit more aggressive. It's going to run like mirror images, which are great in combination with Mana Worm and Sorcerer's Apprentice. But it'll still go fairly high. I think Antonitis is usually your high end on that. I would say the tempo version is slightly better than your standard mid-range. Maybe standard kind of mid-range I would put in like the C tier. Definitely playable. But with tempo, it's different than Hunter. It is a swingy deck. Its matchups are kind of all over the place. So you're very unfavored against Control Warrior and Zoo. Control Warrior, because you just tend to not be able to have enough steam. They just generate so much armor. Your burn isn't really that great. They get into their late game control tools and just kind of grind you out. And Zoo, because it's just hard to get that tempo going versus Zoo. It can happen if you've got like Mana Worm, Coin, Arcane Missiles, and you kill a Flame Imp or something on turn 1. The game is suddenly like hugely in your favor. But if you don't get that kind of opening, it's really, really tough to claw your way back. You don't usually include board clears. I've seen people argue for like a single Flame Strike, but even that, it's like so late in the game, usually too late by that point. So those are two matchups where you really struggle. But I've played this deck during ladder sessions where I just don't run into those two matchups all that often, maybe one or two. And my win rate is very, very high across the board. It kind of doesn't matter what else I'm facing. So, now, I don't think it's necessarily favored against everything else on ladder. I won't go that far. But it does pretty well, and it does provide a bit of an opportunity. I like the skill cap that I think you can display with the deck. A lot of your early turns are very straightforward. But it's kind of like Zoo, where your choice of, how much board clearing versus how much damage to face do I want to do. And there's a bit of flexibility in how you build it. You can go more aggressive on the burn end with things like Ice Lance. I kind of like Ice Lance as like a one of. It's good for generating fireballs with Antonitis. You can just freeze a minion for a bit of utility to push more damage to their face, secure the minions you have on board. Or you can combo it with Frostbolt, get that extra damage if you need the burn. Yeah, it's an interesting list. Also highly recommend Mirror Entity in it. And I don't even mind a single Vaporize, even though it sort of gets away from that tempo style since it's like a little more of a reactive card. But when it's paired with Kirin Tor, it's just so strong to be able to play 2 cards on turn 3. And I think you really want 3 secrets in a Kirin Tor deck. So Yeah, really interesting list. Very polarizing across a whole season. I'm sure you get a smattering of matchups. So, you just kind of end up in the middle of all those doing pretty good, I think, into Legend. But yeah, wouldn't expect to get to the top of the ladder or anything like that. Up in A, I've got Paladin, and this is really going to be like Crusher's mid-range Paladin or some variant of it. He's played it at a very high level. I've played it a number of times. Just always does really, really good. It is not a top tier deck. I think it is an underrated deck, though. You can play it to, yeah, I would say top 50 Legend. If you're a good enough player, I'd say that pretty confidently by the end of the season if this is all you played. And it doesn't seem to have a lot of weak matchups either. It's very much a play minions on curve type thing. You can generate a ton of value with buffs, Divine Shield, and Blood Knight. So Blood Knight, a lot of times you'll do like an Argent Squire into Coin Blood Knight, or a couple Argent Squires into a Blood Knight on 3. It can also be great defensively because Zoo players are running Argent Squires. If you're running up against a decent amount of Shaman, you're going to see it. It's just a pretty popular card, and very worst case, a 3-mana 3/3. It's just fine in other matchups or in cases where you're not generating that insane value. But yeah, it can eat removal. You can drop a Divine Shield on it as long as it's not getting silenced or getting some of that super cheap removal like a Hex or an Execute or something. It's going to really help you snowball the game out of control. And then just a lot of solid Paladin cards, right? Your True Silver Consecrate goes up into like Lay on Hands, Tyrion, that kind of thing. So very strong across the board. Love equality in matchups like Druid or against Handlock. So very versatile. And yeah, I think they're super underrated. If you're looking for something mid-range that you don't often see on ladder, but is still very, very ladder viable, highly recommend you try it. I think it is very, very strong. Now, finally, I got Druid and Shaman up top here. So with this Druid deck, if we're talking mid-range, I'm thinking of Token Druid, right? It's going to excel in that mid-game, right? Violet Teacher's kind of the magic card. Now, Druid is weird. You're not generally running Wild Growth in these token decks. I do see it sometimes. I think it's better to just stick with Innervate. But it means you can get insane value in the mid-game, or you can push those kinds of cards like Violet Teacher out even earlier. But yeah, it's got the ability to just do insane things in that mid-game by doing something like Violet Teacher, Innervate, Power of the Wild. That alone is going to give you a 4/6 that has an effect that can continue to proc with 2/2/2s on board. It's a lot of 2s. And potentially any extra buffs from anything that survived up until that point, which is very possible because you'll run some sticky stuff like Argent Squire, Harvest Golem a lot of the time. So it's just a very, very strong deck. I think it's slightly worse than your standard ramp combo Druid. And yes, this is also a combo deck. This is where, all these deck terms and archetypes get a bit muddled. I'd say it's mid-range, it's token, it's combo, it's kind of all that. But it is a deck that excels in the mid-game. And it's going to do better against stuff that tries to go wide. So if you're dealing with a lot of Zoo, a lot of mid-range Shaman, this is going to contest the board a bit better. And a little more consistently as well, because you're not relying on those wild growths. It's a strong deck. Yeah, going to improve some of your matchups, like I said, over something like Ramp. But if you play it all season, definitely, yeah, you could be top 50 Legend, maybe top 30, something like that. You'll be up around the top of the ladder if you're able to pilot the deck with enough skill. And that finally leaves Shaman. Now, these aren't necessarily in order, by the way. Like, I think Druid is better than Shaman or anything like that. If they're in the same tier, I kind of see them as the same. Mid-range Shaman, very, very strong. It's favored against Druid, typically speaking, especially that Ramp Druid, which you just see so much of on ladder. It makes it such a strong deck, and it's pretty good in most other matchups. So Maybe slightly unfavored against Miracle Rogue, but we're talking, 48% win rate, something like that. And quite good against a lot of other stuff. Favored against Control Warrior. Where it suffers is the Zoo matchup. It really struggles against Zoo. If Hunter is being very, very aggressive, it can struggle there as well. But I think that's really its only setback. If you're playing it for an entire season, you're going to have these swaths of Zoo. Until the bots are dealt with, that Diamond 5 to Legend would be a pain with this deck. It would be extremely painful, but this is where I think you would have a huge dip. As long as you could just manage a streak good enough to be able to get to Legend, then once you're away from the Zoo bots, you'd be just fine. You could coast to very high Legend. Because it's very strong against stuff that's good on the ladder. It's just strong in general across the board. If you see things that you don't typically run into, your Paladins, whatever, any of these other kind of weird tempo decks at the bottom. Really, really solid. And it's, again, another deck that I think lets you display your skill as a player. I think there's a lot of opportunity for it. I've said it before, it's often hard to see where that skill is, because I think it looks like hero power on 2 or maybe hero power pass on 4 or 5, something like that, which doesn't seem like the most skillful play, but knowing when to commit to the board, when to generate value from your flame tongues, things like that. That's really what separates a great mid-range shaman player from just your average one. So definitely think it warrants being talked about. But yeah, if you were going to play it throughout a whole season, you're going to hit some rough patches when you're running into Zoo, so you'd have to be cautious about that. So yeah, that's kind of it for mid-range tempo. Feel free to argue, shout. I'm expecting a barrage of insults, as always. It's fun making these things. We'll keep it going with other archetypes going forward, and continue to stir up the pot in Classic.